I'd like to introduce Kathleen Morgan. She is the Executive Director of the Lawrence Public Library Foundation. So, thank you.
Thank you. Before I get started, I want to make a special plug for an upcoming program here at the Dole Institute. On May 12th, the Dole Institute will present a program called World War II, the African American Experience. So please mark your calendars and plan to attend. As Quinn said, my name is Kathleen Morgan, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Lawrence Public Library Foundation. The library, together with Theodore Lawrence, KU Libraries, the Douglas County Community Foundation, the NAACP Lawrence Chapter, Friends of the Library, and 18 other community partners are so very pleased that the Dole Institute has joined this year's Read Across Lawrence program. This program asks the question, what would happen if everyone in Lawrence read the same book at the same time and got together to talk about it? And this year's Read Across Lawrence selection is Harper Lee's classic novel, To Kill a Mockingbird. Tonight's program will feature a conversation with Alex Hurd, who has written a book called The Eyes of Willie McGee. It's a tragic, real-life To Kill a Mockingbird story. The book has earned rave reviews from the New York Times Book Review, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, and has been nominated for an Edgar Award, which is a prestigious honor bestowed by the Mystery Writers of America. And our guest will be interviewed by Dole Institute Director Bill Lacey. I was fortunate to have met Alex 28 years ago when my husband and I moved out to Washington, D.C. to work for Senator Dole and then Secretary of Transportation Elizabeth Dole. We were all Kansans in a great big city, and we sort of found each other. Even though Alex was born in Mississippi, he had spent his teen years in Garden City, Kansas. He was working as a reporter with the Chronicle of Higher Education. Alex welcomed us into his group of friends, all living in a house nicknamed as the Elmer Fudd Chancery. It was home to writers, a lawyer, a national security agency Russian translator, an independent film producer, a Japanese sushi chef, and a guy who we all swore was a Chinese spy. That's right. But we all watched as Alex moved from his education writing to freelancing for the New Republic, Vanity Fair, and Harper's Magazine. Soon he was writing for the Washington Post magazine, where he served as its humor columnist. Then he did his first stint with Outside Magazine, and it was off to the New York Times, Wired Magazine, and then back to Outside Magazine, where he currently serves today as its editorial director. In 1999, Alex wrote his first book, Apocalypse Pretty Soon, Travels in End Time America. So there's a reason that Alex has been so very successful in his career. He's a meticulous researcher and an excellent writer. The Eyes of Willie McGee is based on exhaustive documentary research, court transcripts, newspaper reports, archived papers, letters, FBI documents, and recollections of family members on both sides. In it, Alex tells a moving and unforgettable story that evokes the bitter conflicts between black and white, North and South in America during that era. And for those of you who have not had the opportunity to read or buy this great book, you are in luck tonight. Copies will be for sale following the program, and Alex will be available to sign them. So please join me in welcoming Alex Hurd.
Great job, Kathleen. Thank you. Alex, let's start tonight. Talk a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got hooked into writing.
Well, I'm from Mississippi. I was born in Jackson, Mississippi in 1957. Went to school there through first half of ninth grade, and then my family moved to Garden City, which was a good thing for me because I wasn't the best student in the world in Mississippi, but it was kind of a good chance to kind of rethink my priorities, and really enjoyed going to high school in Garden City, where we had great teachers that I still think of often today, and got interested in writing more. It didn't really happen there. It happened, I went to Fort Hays State for 2 years and acted in plays and things like that, and wasn't especially good at that. So I transferred to Vanderbilt, where you went, and I needed a new thing to not be good at, so I decided to start writing for the student newspaper and magazine. And that was just for me, it was a moment like, this is it. This is what I think I really enjoy doing. And it was the publications there, you had a lot of freedom. so it was a great way to experiment. And after graduation, I just moved to DC and began trying to write for magazines, which is a slow process with a lot of failure, but finally things got going a little bit.
How did you get your gig at Outside to begin with?
I was writing for them as a freelance writer in the early 90s, and they offered me a job. Excuse me. So, and I moved, and they were in Chicago, worked there for 4 years, then went to the New York Times Magazine as an editor, and then Wired, and then back to Outside. And it sounds like I'm a job hopper or just can't stay employed, but what happens in magazines a lot is for various reasons, you move from one place to another, usually as a way to improve your position. A lot of times the editor you're working for might get fired. Magazine business is full of turmoil. But Outside, I also wanted to go back there because it's just a very fun magazine, and we cover a wide range of material, and it's got a great tradition of just good literary nonfiction and reporting. So he was already under siege. Everyone knew these stories were coming, and he was not talking to any journalists. He refused all requests as this kind of sandbag was about to drop on him. We had written about him before, so I had his phone number and email, and I just said, you know, you never know. So I emailed him, and then I called him. It was like 9 o'clock last Friday evening. And he picked up the phone, and all of a sudden we were talking for a total of, that night, an hour and a half, and I interviewed him 2 more times, a total of 5 hours. And it was great because I ended up running the story on our website as a Q&A, and I knew from reporting I had done, even though the stories hadn't come out yet, what the allegations basically were going to be, so I was able to ask him pretty detailed questions about what was going on, because this thing, if you're following the news, you know it's blown up into a major story because Mortenson is admired all over the world. President Obama has given money to the organization. The U.S. military has had a lot of admiration for him. For a while, the book was required reading, and it's all about using schools as a way to, introduce American aid over there with a kind face. So the story is still blowing up, and as it stands, the only interview that's been done at length was the one I was lucky enough to get. I don't think we know yet how this is all going to turn out, but it's obviously going to get pretty ugly. He's going to be sued. The Attorney General in Montana is investigating whether there's anything to the allegations that funds were mishandled. My guess is that he's being depicted right now as a fraud and basically an evil person who's been caught red-handed. I think based on my reporting and interviewing him, I don't think it's quite that bad, that he's somebody who shouldn't have been running an organization, but he should still probably be the star of the organization, and I hope they're able to work it out.
And it's a fascinating piece, and I'd recommend it to all of you. Let's switch gears and talk about the book now. What was it about Willie McGee's story that really captured your imagination?
Well, once I got to the level of understanding, and just to quickly summarize what's been going on, the case, for those of you who have read To Kill a Mockingbird, you know that there's a dramatic court case at the heart of everything. An African-American man named Tom Robinson is falsely accused of raping a young white woman named Mayella Ewell. And in that book, it's very clear, I don't want to spoil it if anyone hasn't finished it, but I think you all know from the movie or the book that it becomes very clear that he didn't do it. And in some ways, what the plot of that aspect of the book is about, just showing that the justice system at that time and place, it was South Alabama during the Depression, made it impossible for him to get justice even though he was clearly innocent. In the case I'm writing about, the time frame is a little different. That was set in the early 30s. This case that I wrote about was set in 1945, but it involved the same thing. An African-American male whose name was Willie McGee was accused by a white housewife named Willette Hawkins of breaking into her home before dawn on a day in November 1945, forcibly raping her in her bed, and then running out the front door and escaping for a couple of days. So it was the same thing. He was arrested, and he was charged with raping a white woman in a southern town, and it wasn't very far from where the fictional town in To Kill a Mockingbird was set. It's really about 100 miles away. And so the same forces came into play in this case. From the moment he was arrested, his life was in danger simply because he had been accused of raping a white woman. And as happens in the novel, the first thing they do after arresting him and booking him and I think beating him, which routinely happened in those days, is they got him out of town. They took him to the capital city, which is Jackson, Mississippi, where there was a jail that was in a county courthouse that was 5 stories tall, and the jail cells were on the top 2 floors. And in Mississippi in this era, they would always take defendants accused of rape or murder who were black and get them out of the town where they were arrested and take them to this jail. It was called the mob-proof jail. They had to do that to protect them from the very likely possibility that they would be lynched. So McGee had a trial similar to the one depicted in To Kill a Mockingbird. In the first trial, there were 3 in all. He had court-appointed local lawyers who, unlike Atticus Finch, didn't want to work on this case and really didn't try very hard to do much of a defense, and they were prevented. Anything they tried to do, the judge kind of shut them down anyway. So what's different about this case is even though it started out as another one of these obscure small-town race-based, almost a lynching, he was convicted quickly and given the death penalty. And that was the beginning, and that was in late 1945. The case ended up lasting until May of 1951. And over the years, there were 3 trials, multiple appeals to the state and U.S. Supreme Court, and it grew over a period, especially starting in the late 40s. It became a famous case, and one big difference with this one was that Willie McGee's defense and all these levels from courtroom to the appeals level was paid for behind the scenes at first and then later publicly by the Communist Party of the U.S. So it was a case with a lot of political overtones, and the To Kill a Mockingbird story is much more confined. It doesn't take on national and international implications. But by the end of the McGee case, it had become a controversy because his defense team and McGee himself said that he had been railroaded and that he had not raped this woman, but that they had had a secret and long-term consensual love affair that she had instigated and that she'd trapped him into, crying rape only when they were discovered. So by 1951, when this case came to a close, there were 2 competing versions of reality, that he did it or that she did it. And the case was heavily politicized because on the one hand you had the prosecution who were the white power structure in Mississippi and segregationists all to a man versus Northerners, many of whom actually were communists. So it was very politicized. And by the end, it was such a well-known cause that President Truman was pulled into it. So very famous figures like Truman and Einstein and Josephine Baker, Paul Robeson, all sorts of public figures of international renown found themselves taking a side on this case, even though they didn't really always know the facts very well.
This was an international story. It was a big national story. It was actually an international story.
Mm-hmm.
But over the years, it really kind of faded from the public consciousness. Why did it fade away, and why did you think it was important to bring it back and to cover it in a book?
Well, it faded, I think, partly for the same reason it became famous. The Communist Party, who again paid for the defense, and really during the several years of appeals that started in 1948, they did a great job of using the case as a propaganda tool. So they did that here in the U.S., and it happened overseas. So just for example, this man ended up being executed. I'm not giving anything away because that's in the first sentence of the book. But the night it happened, the Soviet Union was sending out continuous shortwave radio broadcasts denouncing the United States imperialist action of killing this innocent man. So it was at that level. Troops in Korea had leaflets dropped on them that said, "Free Willie McGee." So it was at that level. But that same, even at the time, their ability to publicize the case also caused a lot of people to reject the case. There was a schism between the Communist Party, which had a civil rights arm, and a group like the NAACP, which also often defended cases like this. They would have nothing to do with Willie McGee because it was the Cold War, and it was very clear that if you got involved in that case, you were getting mixed up with communists. So it was tainted in that way. And at the time, people who otherwise might have been sympathetic to someone like McGee, mainstream liberals, for example, many of them stayed away from it for that reason. So it was a big mess, and it had Cold War political baggage that I think is part of the reason it went away. After he was executed, who needed this case anymore because it was sort of so controversial because of communist involvement. And then what happened is you get to 1954 and the major events of the civil rights movement start kicking into gear. Brown versus Board, Martin Luther King emerging. And then in 1955, you had the Emmett Till lynching in Mississippi. He was a teenage boy who was lynched for allegedly maybe whistling at a white woman in a store. And the horror of that crime, to me, it was as if people, if they had heard of McGee, who needed that case anymore? Because there was this case was such a stark and electrifying episode that you really didn't need to think about someone like Willie McGee anymore. So it just sort of disappeared.
People always look at cases like this and they want to know what the truth was. And you just said that you can't definitively know the truth in this particular case. How does that change how you wrote this book?
Well, when I started working on it, I didn't know what I would find out. For all I knew, it would be easily solved. But what I did notice is that if you read about the case, if you were to do a Google search of Willie McGee and look at things other than what I wrote about it, you'll see that over the years what happened is the people who did remember the case, it would be written about briefly in history books and magazine articles, never full length. Somehow it evolved that it was proven during this procedure of the trials and appeals that Willie McGee was telling the truth and the woman was lying. And so when I encountered it, that's what I confronted, like, oh, it's case closed. And in fact, I called an Innocence Project, I think it was one of the ones in Illinois, because they had on their website that Willie McGee had been exonerated, through an official procedure after the fact, declaring that he was innocent. So I called them and I said, what proof did you guys find that he was innocent? And they said, oh, that's a mistake. A student put that on there and we didn't know. So they took it off. And what I noticed was that what was written about it didn't seem very well researched, and it usually seemed biased. And what I think happened with this case is that while it was being fought out, there were two fountains of distortion. The Communist Party, the segregationists and the people who wanted Willie McGee to die were doing anything they could, cheating, lying, and even abusing the court system to get their way. What people forgot is that the defense team and the Communist Party in particular were doing the same thing. It was a no-holds-barred battle, and from both sides, a mix of truth and falsehood was just bubbling up. People who wrote about it subsequently only paid attention to the story told by the left, and they assumed that must be true, and they didn't really go back to the fundamentals of, like, what do the court records say? What do the appeals say? What do the old newspaper clips say? So I just got interested in, like, I knew it was an interesting story, and for the first year I worked on it, it was more of a hobby than anything else, and I was just fascinated to find out what material might even exist, because for a long time the court records in the case were missing. They just weren't in the courthouse, and you'd go down to these county courthouses and they say, oh, that was there was a fire in '62 and a lot of that got waterlogged, or oh, a lawyer checked that out and never brought it back. So it was a real challenge at first just to assemble enough information to make sense of what even happened. And what I tried to do was hit everything I could on the documents front. So I did Freedom of Information Act requests because the case was closely watched by the FBI. I did find all the transcripts from the 3 different trials that occurred. So started to get a lot of paper. The other thing I tried to do was I just made a list, like, who is every character of note in this book? Are any of them still alive? If they're not alive, and most weren't, do they have children who are grown up and can tell me what they know about it? So I just, over time, tried to track down a relative or a spouse or a child of every major character and to see what they know. And then, of course, the most important ones, the woman who said she was raped had 3 daughters, and Willie McGee had 4 kids and a wife, and that ended up being a very curious part of it. But I found them, and my first interview was with Willie McGee's granddaughter and his 1 surviving daughter. And the first thing they told me just changed everything. During this case, Willie McGee had a wife named Rosalie McGee, who was said to be the mother of his children and his longtime wife, and she became a spokesman for his innocence. And the Communist Party took her all around the North and Midwest and far West on speaking tours, where she was like this brave, independent woman from the South fighting for his life and speaking out about it. When I interviewed his granddaughter and daughter, and they lived in Las Vegas, the first thing they said when we walked in the door was, that woman named Rosalie McGee was not married to, that's not my grandmother, and it's not my mother. So they said she was an imposter, and all these years we've been trying to figure out who she was and why she was going around saying that she was our mother. So I was like, okay, there's one interesting fact. Take it from there. And I knew then, like, this is a true mystery story. In addition to an interesting piece of American history, there was something really strange going on from the Communist Party side of what really happened. And they were using a woman who turned out to be posing as someone she wasn't as one of their chief witnesses for his innocence.
In doing this research along the exact same lines, Alex, you arranged at one point in the process for a meeting of the victim's daughters and the black woman who served as their nanny. How did that meeting go?
Now, that was interesting. Let me back up a little bit, though. Mm-hmm. The woman you're referring to, her name was Bertha Mae Kroll. And during one of my many trips to Laurel, Mississippi to interview people, I would go down there and do a mix of just standard reporting and then just trying to talk to people who were old enough to know something about the case. The woman who was raped or said she was raped had 3 daughters, and they're all alive. So it was interesting. I was in Laurel one time, and I just was talking to people only based on the fact that they were old enough to tell me about the old days. They didn't necessarily have to know anything about the case. And a random encounter with one of them, I believe she was 88 at the time. So I go over to her house, and she was ill and kind of in like a nightgown and a bathrobe. And she says, I sat down and turned on my tape recorder. She goes, Willie McGee was innocent, which I expected she would say because people's opinions break along racial lines. And she goes, I know, and I said, so you think that there was an affair, right? That's usually what you would hear. And she said, no, that's a lie too. And that was a very unexpected combination. She was saying that McGee was was innocent, but so was the woman, that there had not been a rape, but there also hadn't been an affair. I said, where did you arrive at that? Well, I used to be over at their house all the time. And what she described was that she said that her mother worked as a maid for the sister of Willette Hawkins. And they lived just down the street from each other, and they would be over at her house. And she presented me with this grandiose theory that Mrs. Hawkins had mental problems, and that in the middle, she said, I used to see her in the middle of the day. She'd take these naps and she'd have nightmares, and she'd just leap out of her bed screaming like somebody was attacking her. And that sounded like, you're telling me you think she maybe dreamed this whole thing up, that she had a nightmare, pre-dawn one morning and just thought someone had raped her. That's exactly what I think. And she said, Willie McGee was I know he didn't do it because he was gambling the night before, and I was there too. So she had all these things, and you never know when you get a story like that if you're just talking to someone who's, crazy, but she didn't seem like it. Everything she said was pretty coherent. So what was interesting, she said, I remember the three girls. I used to play, watch over them sometimes. So I filed that away. That night, my wife and I traveled to Jackson, which is about 90 miles away. And it just so happened we had an appointment to interview one of the three daughters, who's in her 60s now. And this was an important night where she was finally deciding she was going to talk to me and trust me enough to show me their family pictures. Because up until then, no one had ever seen a picture of Mrs. Hawkins or what she looked like or any biographical information. So she's flipping through this classic old family photo album, and we come to a photo and it says Bertha May, and she's sitting with she's flanked by two little white girls, and it's her, the woman I had interviewed earlier in the day, it's her with these girls when they were little kids. So she obviously was telling the truth about having been in proximity to the family. So I think it was several months later, I arranged for, Bertha May happened to be living in Dallas, Texas at that time, and I arranged for two of the daughters of Mrs. Hawkins to come in, and I just thought, this could lead, who knows where this is going to lead, but I put them all in the room together to see if they knew it was happening, it wasn't a surprise, but just to see if they could swap memories and maybe figure out something that would help solve the mystery. It didn't really happen, but it was interesting. They got along very well, and they were happy to see each other, and there was a lot of laughter and sharing of memories. But when it came to their, they had two different takes on reality. Bertha May said that Willie McGee was innocent and their mother was crazy. That was basically the essence of her theory. And they, of course, firmly believed that she was raped, and that however brutal it was, justice was ultimately done. So they're talking about that, just completely bumping heads, and it actually got a little heated. But they never got angry with each other in a real sense. It was just like, well, you believe what you believe, and I believe what I believe. We're just going to have to leave it there. And this case has that effect on people. I did an event in Atlanta, just a panel like this, and one of the people who's quoted in the book is a famous U.S. African-American athlete named Ralph Boston, who won a gold medal in the long jump in 1960. Ralph grew up in Laurel, and he was of the right age for this case to be playing out when he was a kid. So it's a big part of his background and the lore he grew up with. And I quoted him in the book, and he firmly believed when I was interviewing them that the affair story was true. That's the way it usually goes. So he read the book. He really seemed to like it. And of course, the book takes you away from such certainty towards a more ambiguous position where you're not quite clear what really happened. And he seemed to love the book, but when in this panel someone said, so Mr. Boston, what do you think happened after reading this man's book? He goes, oh, everybody knows it was an affair. So it didn't, however much he liked the book, it didn't change his mind a micron. And I thought that was pretty interesting.
That is. Tell us a little bit about an outsider group that was involved in this whole situation called the White Women's Delegation.
Okay. What happened, as I mentioned, the case got pretty famous towards the end. Especially by 1950, it was a cause that if you were on the far left or in a progressive party like the Henry Wallace Party, which was a left of center offshoot of the Democratic Party that existed for a brief time in the late 40s and early 50s. If you were on that side of the political spectrum, by the summer of 1950, you were well aware of the Willie McGee case, and you were urged to write letters, and there were protests, and it became more and more of a cause. Now, what in the I believe it was but it was later, it was towards the end, it was the spring of 1951. Willie McGee was executed in May of that year. And so in those last few months, there was a lot of protest activity. And one of the more interesting episodes occurred with a group that, as you say, were called the White Women's Delegation. And the leader of it was a famous British writer named Jessica Mitford, who I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. She came from a prominent family in England. They were upper class, and there were several daughters. Some of them are still alive, and they took interesting positions. Jessica Mitford became a communist for several years in the 40s and 50s. Her sister Unity was a Nazi. Her other sister Diana was married to the main leader of the British fascist movement, Oswald Mosley. And there were a couple of other daughters, but they were the ones with the biggest divergence. So by the time she left England, came over to the U.S. and ended up married to a labor lawyer based in San Francisco. And she was the San Francisco or Oakland president of the chapter of this group called the Civil Rights Congress. And they were an arm of the Communist Party. They were their civil rights branch of the party. So she ran that thing. And they did local causes, like police brutality or wrongful arrests, that sort of thing in the Bay Area. But a call went out in the spring of 1950 to people all over the country who were members of the Civil Rights Congress saying, there was an execution date coming up in March of 1951, and there were lawyers wrangling for a stay, which they obtained. But with that coming to a head, officials of the Civil Rights Congress based in New York urged chapter members from all over the country to get themselves to Jackson, Mississippi for on-the-ground physical protests on behalf of Willie McGee. So Mitford, who was a very plucky kind of person, gathered up 3 women who were in the chapter, and they just got in a big car, and it's that Lucy Ricardo era, driving all the way from the Bay Area to Jackson on 2-lane roads. It took them several days to get there. And what they did was they went door to door, getting doors slammed in their faces or having some good conversations, but they were trying to convince people, like, you need to sign our petition. You need to, call your congressman to say that this execution needs to be stopped. So it was just basic street level protesting. It didn't really amount to much. Nothing was going to stop this except the U.S. Supreme Court, which they did for a while. But what was really funny about that story, on the way out of town after several days of fruitless canvassing, she said, well, on our way back to California, let's go up to Oxford, Mississippi, because that's where William Faulkner lives. He had just won the Nobel Prize for Literature a few months earlier. And his famous house is called Roanoke. It's a big, stately, white, not a mansion, but a very nice house. They just walked up and cold called him and knocked on his door, and he had on his, smoking jacket, and I think he had been drinking. So he invites them in and spends the next hour just declaiming how he's sure that Willie McGee is innocent, that he'd been framed. He knew all about the case. He'd been reading about it. And he said, I think this is a sham. So they said, thanks a lot. And they went out and typed a press release up and sent to newspapers instantly. So people raised hell about that down there. Faulkner would do that sometimes. He was not a civil rights activist, and in some ways his opinions would seem pretty retrograde today, but he knew that the system was wrong and that it had to be changed, and every now and then he would spout off like that, and it'd get him in trouble, and then he'd shut up again. But they got their scoop, you could say.
And you had mentioned some earlier, some kind of well-known figures in history. You just told the Faulkner story. There's another person who's in the book who was became a congresswoman after that, Bella Abzug.
Right, and what Bella's role was mainly in the appeals, but just to review again, there were 3 circuit court trials of this case. In the first trial, there was literally a mob atmosphere at the courthouse, so the Mississippi Supreme Court reversed the verdict, saying that there should have been a change of venue. The second trial, another defeat for the defense. They spent most of their time issuing a challenge about the race-based makeup of juries and grand juries in Mississippi, and they got a reversal on those grounds. And then there was a third trial where it was found guilty, and it made it past the Mississippi Supreme Court, and from 1948 through 1951, every legal action was at the federal appeals level. Now during those, starting with the second of the circuit court trials, the Civil Rights Congress up in New York hired young Bella Abzug, who was a recent graduate of Columbia, to run the defense, which didn't mean that she went down to the courthouse in Laurel and actually tried the case. That would have been, she said that would not have been possible. The way it worked, she was the architect of the legal strategy, and she and other people arranged for the lawyers who actually did the defense work in the courtroom. And in McGee's second and third trial, he had good representation from white male lawyers from Jackson, who are the closest counterparts that you see in a case like this to Atticus Finch. These were guys who grew up there and were still working there and had to take the consequences of defending somebody like this voluntarily, and the consequences were pretty heavy. So she was orchestrating that, telling them what to do, but not in the courtroom. Once it entered the appeals phase, her role became public, and she was the person often who had to go to Jackson to argue for a stay or something during the appeals process, and it was a tough role because it was dangerous, and there was nobody. The federal government wasn't doing anything to protect a lawyer like her in a case like this. So she had to go down there in July 1950 for a clemency hearing before the Mississippi Supreme Court, and she had trouble getting a hotel room. The federal government had no interest in civil rights causes of this kind. As I mentioned earlier, the only reason they kept track of this case, there's a ton of information in an FBI file. They were following it very closely behind the scenes, but only because the Communist Party was involved. They weren't at all interested in Willie McGee's civil rights or his rights in court. They were just monitoring everything because the party was involved and they were following them. So Bella saw the appeals through to the end, and she was in Jackson, Mississippi on the night of the execution. And in the book, there's a very touching scene about the last couple of days. She and another lawyer named John Coe made some dramatic first-person appeals to the governor, to President Truman. She personally wrote a huge clemency petition that Truman reviewed and wouldn't go near. He was one of the Democrats who wanted nothing to do with any of this because of the communist involvement. But her role was, that's a pioneering position to be in. She was one of the first graduates from the Columbia University Law School, and then to be in a situation like this where there's no roadmap for something like that. So, and there's a lot to admire there in what she went through.
I have one last question, then we're going to open it to you for questions and answers, so be thinking about your questions. We'll have a couple students who will come out in a minute with cordless mics. But Alex, you spent a lot of time in Mississippi, and it's been 60 years since the resolution of that case. How have race relations changed in Mississippi over that 60-year period?
Well, it's interesting. I was in junior high when desegregation of schools finally happened after 16 years of massive resistance. So obviously, many things like that have changed quite a bit. During the case, there were no fundamental rights, and the courts were totally unfair. But nothing's perfect anywhere, and that's true in Mississippi. What I witnessed as a student in 8th and 9th grade during the upheaval of segregation, and in Jackson, it was a major event. It wasn't a slow transition. It happened over the Christmas vacation. We got a little extra Christmas vacation because they were trying to get things sorted out. So first semester of 7th grade, schools were totally segregated. Second semester, I was one of, I think, 23 white kids left in a big junior high, which was suddenly African American. So the key thing is that almost everybody left the system, and they have never come back. There were periods where it looked like the majority of white people might revisit the public schools, and I'm talking about Jackson in particular, but it's true in most of those towns. They left for private schools or church schools, or they moved to counties that were majority white, so that their kids could have a majority white school experience. So you don't have anything like the balance you see in a town like this, and I don't think it's ever going back. I think they have evolved into a separate, race-based system that's you can't do anything about legislatively because it's based on private school choice. But I never saw, I kept track of it, and I never saw a period where there was a massive, let's try to make this work. There was that initial moment of we want to get away from you, and we want to stay, at least on an educational level, and it's never shifted back. So it's not like everybody's in hunky-dory and relations are perfect down there.
Okay. We're going to open it up to your questions. Andrew has a microphone. Do we have somebody else out here with a mic? It's going to be Andrew tonight. It's going to be a track meet, I think, for Andrew tonight. So if you have a question, raise your hand. Andrew will come try to find you, and then we'll call on you. Now, I can't believe everybody's that shy. Come on. Break the ice.
What do you think was the most rewarding interview that you did during the research for this book?
Oh, let me think about that. I really enjoyed talking to the daughters and relatives on both sides of the crime itself. I mean, that was fundamental. But there were some very dramatic ones. One, probably the two most interesting had to do with the events and the aftermath of the execution. The execution was a public event. He was put to death in what was called the portable electric chair. They moved it around to wherever you had been convicted, so it was mobile. And I found a man. I talked to the son of the prosecutor who convicted him for the last time, so who oversaw him going to the chair. And he told a very dramatic story about how his father was racked with doubt at the end about the justice of, the fairness of this verdict, and didn't know himself whether the man he was sending to death was guilty. So he said, my dad went over there with a bottle of whiskey, and he let Willie McGee have several drinks because he was hoping it would loosen him up and he would tell the truth. And so the story is in the book, but what was interesting was to see this son go through the experience of telling what he thought was a very painful chapter in his father's life. That same trip, I met a very old African-American man who I thought I was just interviewing as an old-timer, and for about the first hour of the interview, he said, I don't really know much about that case. So we just talked about his life and career. And then towards the end, he goes, why don't you ask me about Willie McGee? Well, you already told me you don't know anything about it, but he was just sort of deciding whether he would open up to me. And he lived across the street from the funeral home where McGee was placed after his execution and before being taken away to where he was buried. And he told a great story about he just sat on his porch and watched everybody come and go to this funeral home, including law enforcement officials. And he waited till everybody was gone, and he just went over there and looked at him, empty, late at night. He just wanted to contemplate what had just happened to this man. He didn't know if he was innocent or not, but he knew he hadn't been treated fairly. So I found that very moving. There was something about that man that was special.
Other questions?
What scale do you think this case was with the Scottsboro case? Obviously, the communist angle was in both cases, but since it's at the beginning of the Cold War in 1945 and into 1951, how do they kind of come together? Are they different?
Well, it's interesting. The Scottsboro case, for those of you who don't know, involved 9 African-American defendants who were accused by 2 women of rape, and it was pretty definitively proved in that one that they were all innocent, although one of the women never recanted. And the defense for that one was paid for by the Communist Party also. And it's funny, I've read all about that case and looked at the old news stories. Nobody was happy about it then either. But the Communist Party involvement was a bigger problem in the 50s. In the 30s, it was like the Reds, I can't stand them, but they were able to function with controversy, but they won. Ultimately, they weren't the only part of that story. The NAACP was involved. But it was definitely, the communist involvement by the early 50s was more radioactive, and I think it caused even more problems by then.
What can you tell us about Willie's wife, and his children, his family, and so forth?
The wife, Rosalie McGee, that I mentioned, who was something of an imposter, or was an imposter, she's the one you mean? Yeah. Well, basically, I'm sorry, let me back up. He did have 4 kids, and their mother's real name was Eliza Jane Payton. And it turned out that he had left his family in 1942, 3 years before he got in trouble. He was a bit of a vagabond and kind of a wage laborer, and so he had abandoned his family. And a year after he got arrested, his wife divorced him. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out who this woman Rosalie McGee was and how did they even meet. And I'm pretty sure I know she came from a different part of the state, and her name was Rosetta Saffold. They weren't married, and I'm fairly certain that they met because she was visiting a cousin who was in the same jail in Jackson, which is where he was held all the time, and that she, for whatever reason, started talking to Willie McGee and came to care about him a lot through bars. And so she decided he must have said, I need someone to act as my wife because I have enough trouble anyway if I'm a divorced guy. So I think that though she was playing a role and was an imposter, I think she was doing it to help him. And what happened starting in the summer of 1950, she was brought up to New York for the first time, and there are pictures of her at a dinner with Paul Robeson and some other famous people. And I believe that she saw working on the case and helping Willie McGee as a way not only to help him, but to get herself out of Mississippi, which was a dead-end place to be. That's what ended up happening. She moved, after it was all over, she moved to Brooklyn, and I didn't know this in time to have it in the book, but she lived in Brooklyn for the rest of her life and died in the 60s. And when I go there next week, I'm actually going to meet someone who contacted me after the book came out who knew her during those years and is going to tell me more about her.
I have a question. Andrew? I'll go ahead and get that one. We'll get this one right here next.
I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to what you think the motivations of the Communist Party were and how you think the case outcome might have been different had they not been involved in such a big role.
Okay. in the period in the 40s and 30s and 40s, there were two main organizations that existed that provided legal defense in cases like this, because they happened all over the country. Someone accused of rape or murder who was black, and that if they didn't get lynched, they usually received what was called a legal lynching. They were found guilty whether the case was strong or weak. The NAACP, and particularly with lawyer Thurgood Marshall, worked on cases like this all over the place. There was a very famous one in Oklahoma. After World War II, the Communist Party said, we need a group like that that does the same thing, but on behalf of our cause, which is exposing the hypocrisy of the American justice system. So they set up their own organization. It was a legal defense organization, the Civil Rights Congress, and that's primarily what they did. So in the McGee case, and this often happened, why they heard about it because it was reported on in the Daily Worker, which was the Communist Party organ, the daily newspaper. There was a little story, and a man in the Civil Rights Congress ripped it out and said, we ought to look into this one. So they got to Willie McGee first by sending someone down south to investigate it, and that's what had happened in the Scottsboro case. There was a predecessor to the Civil Rights Congress called International Labor Defense. But the basic gist is that the NAACP and the communist group, they would compete with each other to gain control of the case and the trust of the family members so that they could turn it into a cause. And sometimes the NAACP won, sometimes they lost, and in this case, they lost. And once the Civil Rights Congress had control of the case, the NAACP wanted nothing to do with it. So even though Willie McGee was someone they would normally be sympathetic towards, they stiff-armed him right up until the very end, just saying that would have been a good case for people to rally behind, but the communists have ruined it, so we have to stay away. Now, the question I'm often asked is, if Thurgood Marshall had been running everything, would the outcome have been different and Willie McGee might have been saved? I don't have any way of knowing that, but I feel sure that it wouldn't have been. The desire to execute him was so white hot down there that I don't think anything was going to deter them.
We have a question right here.
Do you see a parallel here with the Duke lacrosse case? Maybe you'll write a book about that.
Well, there's a pretty good book already written about that, but that case is a good example of the way our preconceptions about things make us decide before we know much what probably happened. And I felt guilty of that. Even though I was working on this other thing, which was teaching me to clear your mind and not think you know what's going on in a situation until you really have read about it. When I heard about that case, I actually assumed that the rape had happened, that those lacrosse frat boy guys had done everything. And so it was a big lesson for me. Like, I'm doing it too, because I spend a lot of time in the book analyzing the process of why people, why their biases can lead them to have such firm opinions about things that they don't know much about. And I did it myself. So there are parallels in that way, just that a hysteria sets up around something and you think you understand it and you really don't.
A question right here.
If you were starting over writing the book, would you change anything?
I don't think I would. I mean, if I had a chance to rewrite it, all I would do is add a little bit of new information I've found. But the book arrives at an ambiguous place. I don't know. I don't claim to know what happened. I do say that it was unfair for him to be executed because there was never a fair trial and the appeals courts didn't do much good for him. But I feel pretty sure now that that's the only conclusion I could have arrived at, because one thing I discovered from the research is that the defense lawyers and the prosecutor, they weren't sure either. You can tell that they didn't really know whether he was guilty or innocent, but they had their roles and they played them. So I don't think it's knowable at this point what really happened. I would say that if you look at his alibis, they tend to have some holes in them that do raise eyebrows and make you wonder, you know, why was he lying? Why was there a fake wife on the scene? And the imposter wife was the only other person who swore to the events as he described them. So it ultimately comes down to her word versus his, and the system supported her word to the point of the death penalty for him.
What's your next book going to be?
I don't have any ideas. So if you have one, please tell me.
We have time for one more question if somebody has one. We haven't had a student ask a question tonight. We have a few students kind of lurking in the back. I really don't know. Okay. Well, Alex, thank you very much for coming tonight. Really wonderful. Great program.